The Other Side Podcast, Episode 1. Welcome to the Other Side Podcast. I am your host, Justin Spears. Excited to be with you today. So, really excited to be starting this podcast. It's been delayed a little bit. Wanted to try to get this thing launched last week, but had a situation come up, and so I'm glad to be recording today and excited to get this thing going. What I wanted to do here in episode 1 is kind of just give you guys a little bit of a background as to what our goals are here, what we're wanting to accomplish, what we're wanting to do with hosting this podcast, and just kind of, again, talk a little bit about where the genesis of this came from, and then kind of talk a little bit about what you're going to hear as you tune in to this podcast. My goal as I go throughout this is going to be to provide you with information, but my main goal is not to teach you what to think, but more encourage you to think and to encourage you to explore into the content that we're going to talk about here on a hopefully somewhat a regular basis. We haven't set an exact rotation yet for how often we will be producing these podcasts. I think we're going to kind of start slow. We don't want to overcommit, but certainly this is something that as we get going, we could potentially produce one a week, but we'll see. Right now our goal is to maybe get one every other week, so 2 a month out to you guys. So I keep saying we, right? Who is we? Well, for those of you that don't know me, if you stumbled across this podcast somewhere out there on the internets, my name is Justin Spears, and I am a social studies teacher at North Montgomery High School. I have been teaching in the classroom now for about 7 years. I've taught business, and I've been teaching government and economics and world history for a little over a year and a half now. And really enjoy what I do as a teacher. There are a lot of challenges for what I do, and that's one of the things that we'll talk about throughout these podcasts. But in my position out at North Montgomery, I have a colleague named Mr. Mike Margison, and Mike and I have built a friendship over this last year and a half, and one in which we ideologically see the world very similar. We're not in lockstep on everything, but we by and large agree with a lot of things. And so we oftentimes have discussions and conversations about things going on in the world. And he also, too, is a social studies teacher. And by the way, is just a brilliant mind. I always enjoy the time that I get to talk with him. And every time I walk away the conversation with him, I always feel more enlightened about something. Just when I think that I've thought about a particular topic or issue a certain way and seen all aspects of it, he inevitably will introduce something to me, and I'll walk with him, man, I never thought about that. So just a great mind to have. He's our department chair. He's been in education for quite some time now, and he is just, I think you're really going to enjoy his side of this podcast. So the way in which this kind of started is he came to me one day and he let me know, hey, I'm thinking about putting together a podcast. And I said, that's funny. I've kind of been thinking about the same thing. So we started kicking this idea around of what we want this thing to look like. And we both were in agreement on one thing. And that was that we definitely kind of have this, and I don't want to speak wholly for him, but I think he would say this as well, this kind of jaded sense of what public education has become in terms of what we are kind of handcuffed to having to do as public education teachers. That's one thing. We also, I think, lament the state of the student in education. And the fact that we get a lot of young men and women in front of us, particularly he teaches some AP courses, but I have a lot of seniors, obviously, in government and economics that just do not have a desire to want to learn. They're just very disinterested in the events surrounded with government and economics. And so there's that aspect of it. But then there's also this aspect of standards and what the classroom has to look like as public education teachers today, and how much that hamstrings us in terms of what kind of content we can provide to our students. So Mike's going to handle the economics side of things, mixing in some history. I'm going to primarily focus on the government side, again, mixing in some history. And if you listen to both of us, you'll probably hear some overlay. We again, both probably would identify, and again, I'm not going to speak wholly for him, but I certainly have identified more here recently with the libertarian model in terms of government. And I'm actually going to start by talking a little bit about that today. And on the economic side, he is going to talk a lot about the Austrian school. Which, just as a side note, I've been doing a lot of reading on the Austrian school, and have been just kind of really engrossed with Hayek and Friedman and Rothbard and a lot of these guys that just, these libertarian minds in the Austrian school, and they're just fantastic, and you find them just so rarely available. Now, of course, obviously in the world we live in today with the internet, they're easy to find online, but I was walking through a bookstore the other day, and I had some time to kill. I was waiting, and I thought, I'll go over and check out the economics section in this particular store. And I shouldn't be surprised, but I was, to find that there was very little Austrian theory or mindset in what was represented in the books. It was all Krugman and Freakonomics and Keynesian type models of economics, and then we wonder why there's not an understanding and appreciation for that. So at any rate, he's going to talk a lot about that, and I know he's going to do a fantastic job. He's just a really well thought out and reasoned person, and puts a lot of thought into what he does. And so I encourage you to give his podcast a listen as well. These will be nested together on our website, and we'll make sure we update you each and every time that we put new content out. So having said all that and gotten that out of the way, I want to start to dive into kind of the goal and the vision of my side of the podcast, which, as I mentioned, is going to be on government. And when I was building out the vision for this, I wrapped it around a series of topical issues in society, right? That's a pretty low-hanging fruit way of going about doing it, right? You just identify a bunch of issues in society that relate to government, and you attack them, and we're certainly going to do that. I'm going to talk about things like the death penalty, gun control, abortion, gay marriage, education, taxation, just anything that obviously the government has a role in. But one of the things that I want to do first, and this is where I'm going to get into this today, is in having conversations and discussions with people via Facebook, Twitter, just in person, whatever it might be, a trend that I've noticed, and I've always lamented the fact that we as a society today, we don't engage in dialogue. Right? We don't. If you go back and you watch, and one of my favorite shows to watch, it was a series that was done back probably in the early 80s on PBS, was a Milton Friedman series, Free to Choose. And I'm reading the book on that now, and I've watched the episodes. And what Friedman did in these episodes is he went around and he recorded on a topic about a 30-minute video that would inform the viewer on his side of an issue. But then probably more important was about a 30-minute follow-up that he held, I believe, at the University of Chicago, where he would have about 2 to 3 minds representing each side of the topic. It wasn't always people that were in total agreement with him. And you see this type of thing today on cable news networks, whether it's a Hannity or an O'Reilly or whatever it might be. And it just, 30 seconds in divulges into people yelling and screaming. And it's just, there's nothing constructive that comes out of these things. But Friedman and the method and the model that he used is there was this appreciation for one another, that you allowed the other side to present their argument. You might shoot it down and you might, obviously attack it, but it was done in a respectful manner. And I really appreciate that, even though I would watch some people on that show and go, man, that person's so off base. But everybody afforded that individual the opportunity to speak their mind and really gave them thought. That's the other thing, too, not just to speak their mind, right? But they actively listen and responding to what they were saying. So at any rate, that's really something that I've kind of lamented about where we are as a society today, that in an age of talking points and scoring points, the art of dialogue and debate has really, really suffered because of that. But then also, too, in listening as much as you can to people try to present their ideas, there's this sense of just jumping in the middle of whatever the topic is. So I rattled off a number of topics earlier that we're going to talk about and address. And I just want to encourage you, and I have to be reminded of this myself often, to go back to the beginning, to go back to the origin of what it is that you're looking at. That is so important. No matter what the topic is, if you jump in the middle, you're going to be missing a lot. And it's really going to skew the outcome that you get in terms of whatever it is that you're addressing, the topic that you're addressing. So I think it's really important that we try to engage in hitting those two things with this podcast. And again, I want to encourage further dialogue with this podcast. Yeah, I certainly want you to engage with me via social media. You're welcome to email me directly. I'll give out our email address and contact me, and let's carry on the conversation. I am not here to tell you that I have all the answers. That is not the intention of why we are doing this. This is simply a starter to get people thinking about topics that, quite honestly, I don't think we give enough thought into, and therefore we don't get the well-reasoned, well-rationed arguments, and we don't know how to present them in a positive manner. So again, that's kind of what my goal is. Each time I put together a podcast, no matter what the topic is, to give it the proper credence, and then also to engage in further discussion as we move forward. And I will always try to present sources. I'll try to link any articles that I use in topics that we go over as well, so you'll be able to go and follow up, read. That's one of the things I enjoy about a lot of the podcasts that I listen to and subscribe to is the vast amount of resources. I have spent hours reading through articles that have been linked on podcasts and educated myself further on topics that I didn't know that type of information was out there. So what I'm going to start with topically today, I had initially thought about just jumping right into my first topic, which I wanted to discuss education. And I'm going to get there in a couple episodes, but I wanted to spend the first episode or two here. As I mentioned, we're going to focus on government. And I, again, wanted to go back to the beginning and not just jump into where we are in 2017 America, the role of government in our lives, the expectations of government. What do individuals think of what the role of government should be in our lives? And it's very easy to come on here and just start trashing the government, whether it be obviously at the national level, the state level, on both sides, Republicans, Democrats. There's really not much of a difference there today, it seems. But I wanted to kind of go back and give a little bit of a historical perspective here. And this is one of the things that, as I relate back to in the classroom, where I try to get my students to understand the gravity and the seriousness and how what went on back in the 1780s and then moving forward still is so relevant today, right? And no matter what the topic is. And one of the things that I use in the classroom a lot, just because it tends to catch the students' attention, is we were just talking about the Constitution these last couple of weeks. is, we get to like the 9th and 10th Amendment, and we were talking about states' rights versus the national government, the federal government's rights. And we kind of talked about this idea of the war on marijuana, right? And over the last decade or so at least, and I'm sure people would probably, date that even further back, but, here over the last decade for sure, there's been a movement by the states, right, to say, hey, listen, this isn't your role, federal government. This is a states' rights issue. And so, we kind of use that as an entry point to kind of talk about that. We talk about, prohibition of alcohol and things of that nature, and other issues, certainly with education. So we need to go back and talk about the roots of the national government. And one of the things, too, that you'll find as I go through this, and I tell my students this all the time, words matter. Today we use words, and I don't know, they just kind of get thrown around, and okay, yeah, people just accept it. And one that's a pet peeve of mine is when we refer to, and you probably heard me a minute ago, refer to our general government or our national government as our federal government. And I try to avoid doing that, because if you understand the roots of and understand the meaning behind what a federal form of government is, you will probably quickly agree and understand that that's not what we have today. Federalism, as it is defined, is shared power between a national government, central government, and state and local government, right? And this was at the cornerstone of the debate in Philadelphia as we moved from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution. So let's kind of go back and use that as our entry point here, and go through a couple of things that I want to try to encourage you to think about and explore. Go and read a little bit more about these issues and these topics here, because they are very, very important to understanding, why is it that Washington, D.C. is so powerful today? And why is it that in my state, we are not allowed to do X, Y, and Z? That we would have the national government withhold money from us, or we would have some alphabet agency, knocking on our doors and busting in our houses and homes and, telling us that we're committing a felony with what we're doing. So those are things that, again, we have to go all the way back to the starting point here. So again, if you understand what was going on in the country under the Articles of Confederation, which, by the way, I personally feel get an absolute bad rap. With what you were presented in high school or in your formal education, or what you've researched and read about the Articles of Confederation, you're probably not going to find a lot of good stuff, right? You're pretty much going to get a summary that says, yeah, it was this first guiding principles that we used as a country, but it was found relatively quickly to not be an efficient document to govern us as a country. Well, I personally believe that's absolutely false, right? And understanding that what that meant was, as a confederation, a loosely formed group of states that were united in protectionism of one another, and some common trade and things of that nature, but that there were sectional divides already within the country, and that these states had different ideas and opinions. Obviously, there were different religions, there were different trades and sectors and markets within these individual states. There was no real overarching commonality between them. But one of the negatives that you typically hear about right off the bat is, well, there wasn't this power to tax, right? That the national Congress didn't have the power to tax, and so that created all kinds of issues. And well, there wasn't really much in the way of protection here with armies and navies, no standing armies and navies, so that was an issue. And then there were some uprisings and rebellions, and Washington had to saddle up on his horse and go put down a couple of rebellions. And so, there's all these different things that get thrown out to kind of, say this thing was doomed before it began. And so it was our destiny that we would have this Constitution. Well, again, this simply is not true. There was a lot of support for the Articles of Confederation, and in fact, the group that would become known as the Federalists, right? Madison, Washington, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton. These guys had to push all sorts of buttons to get the states together in Philadelphia to meet and amend the Articles of Confederation, which, by the way, again, you probably didn't hear this in your formal education, or you may not have known this, that was the original intent of the meeting in Philadelphia, of the convention in Philadelphia. If you recall or remember the phrase, the Annapolis Convention, right? This was these guys getting together in Annapolis, Maryland, and hosting a summit, so to speak, and saying, look, what can we do to get the representatives of the states, the delegates of the states, to come here and meet with us? And they said, what we need to do is we need to amend the Articles of Confederation. And so that was the original charge that was taken to the state houses all throughout the nation at that time to say, and there's video of this that you can see. People have recreated this through video, and a great resource, by the way, is Mike Church has put together a piece that does a fantastic job of showing what this, probably looked like through the documentation that we have on it, where they went through and read the reasons that were given to them as to why they were there in Philadelphia for the convention. And it essentially was that they were there to amend the Articles of Confederation, not to create a new form of government. And again, as you explore and understand what then transpires in Philadelphia in 1787, it was absolutely a hijack job by the Federalists, the Virginians in particular, Edmund Randolph, the governor of Virginia, Madison, who is always seen as the father of the Constitution, right? But, Madison, what he put forth as a plan initially was nothing as to what was given in the charges as to why the delegates were allowed to be there. He wanted to create a new form of a stronger central government. And so this almost immediately leads to eyebrows being raised and objections being heard by this. Now, the opposition voice to this was pretty tame at first. And most accounts kind of cite the fact that the delegates were really kind of, for lack of a better phrase, shell-shocked by what they were hearing. They were absolutely not expecting to hear what was being presented by the Virginia plan in terms of this strong central government. And of course, as you can imagine, one of the first things that is brought up is, well, what about the states? What's going to happen to the states under this strong central government? And if you read through the Virginia plan and you understand what is being proposed here, what you find is a strong legislative body that would basically look like the House of Representatives today, without a Senate. And so this becomes a huge sticking point for what would become the anti-federalists, right? And so these are the individuals who are going to put up a fight to what Madison and others present as the Virginia plan, which would be creating this general strong government. And this really then creates a lot of back and forth. It creates a lot of issues with trust. There are signs that, why are we here? And you got to remember that these guys were there on their own accord. These guys weren't career politicians. They left their businesses, they left their families, they left their farms to go to Philadelphia and take part in this. And there's accounts that you can read through that document and show that people were increasingly getting frustrated with what was going on. And so the anti-federalists are the ones who mount a comeback to the Virginia plan in form of the New Jersey plan. And so this then kind of creates some debate, and there's some back and forth, and it almost kind of looks like they're at a stalemate. And, the one kind of voice of reason in all of this was Benjamin Franklin. And he, on a number of occasions, went through and tried to get people to put their personal agendas aside. And that's one of the things that, as you reflect back on what occurred at the Constitutional Convention, is many people have commented on, the motivation behind these guys, that they were there to form a new empire, and they were the ones that wanted to be credited with that. And as you look again at the Virginia Plan and the Federalist Papers, if you read through those, the claims certainly are being made. And Hamilton in particular, who's celebrated today as a hero with his musical and whatnot, had some very scary opinions about what the president and the executive branch would look like. He essentially called for what would be close to a monarchy, right? What we just rebelled from. And so this debate ensues between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. And you normally don't hear much about the Anti-Federalists, right? I mean, there are a series of papers written called the Anti-Federalist Papers. It's been put in a booklet form, much like the Federalist Papers that were penned by John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. But essentially, there's this idea of compromise that has to occur, and they are able to put their differences aside to create the Constitution. But again, what I want to encourage you to do is, as you look at what happened in that exchange in 1787 and moving forward, is the seeds are sown for a strong central government to be created. And ultimately, you can almost kind of see the writing on the wall. Now we get to play this role of, hindsight being 20/20, where we can look back and say, we knew this was going to happen. Obviously, they didn't have that perspective. But it is interesting. And I've always been fascinated by Madison in particular, because it's so odd when you look at what he was presenting in the Virginia Plan. You just shake your head. And he even almost kind of immediately sees the ramifications of what he's done. In the resolutions of 1789, both he and Thomas Jefferson put writings out that would be the foundation for a phrase that we commonly refer to today as nullification, which is the act of what I was referring to earlier, for example, with marijuana, medical marijuana, and marijuana dispensaries throughout the country, where you essentially nullify a federal law by kind of telling the federal government, you don't have the authority to do this, right? And so when we look at the Constitution and the way that it's formed and written, there's a lot of vague terms like general welfare, necessary and proper. Well, those are phrases that have been used by politicians throughout our nation's history to seize on creating more power for the national government. And so it's very interesting as we go through this podcast, we will kind of use that framework, right, to go back and look and see, well, where did this come from, right? Why do we have a Department of Education in our national government? There's nothing in the Constitution that says the national government has a role in education. It should be a state's right. And you can take that model and apply it to a number of different issues that we look at in society. And certainly today we tend to be going more and more down the road of, and I'm not going to blame millennials, I'm not going to blame any in particular generation for this. It's a human condition, I believe, but we are looking more and more for the national government to be our sole provider. And that is in and of itself a very, very dangerous proposition, in my opinion. And I want to conclude with this, and then we'll pick up next week with this. I always tell my students in class to think about the two noble causes or ideas of equality and liberty. Two ideas that are espoused in various different writings in our nation's history, whether it be through the Declaration of Independence, through the Constitution, to other documents that have been written. You hear often these two ideals espoused, liberty and freedom. And I don't know that if you've ever taken time to think much about those two terms. But I read an article and I can't remember, I believe it was through the American Conservative or the Imaginative Conservative, which is greater, liberty or equality? And it got me thinking. And really what I came away with in reading that piece is I said, wait a second, these two terms are diametrically opposed to one another. That if you were to pursue them both, you would essentially wreck your society. And I think that we have seen that throughout the history of our nation. That if you think about it on its surface, right, equality, right, and most people would say, well, equality of what? Equality of opportunity, equality of outcome. I don't think there's any way you could argue that we've definitely moved toward equality of outcome, right? Equal pay, equal rights. These are all equality of outcome measures that have been taken by the federal government to ensure that there is an equal outcome in various different parts of our society. But then if you couple that with the idea of then liberty, right? If you were to take the premise that there needs to be an equality of outcome, right? Well, as I explained in my class, if everybody experiences the same outcome, what freedom is there in that? What liberty is there in that? And I always give them the example of, imagine there's 10 or 15 of you in this class that are pizza shop owners, right? And you all make your own brand of pizza. Are all of those pizzas going to be the same quality? Are they all going to be the same price? And surely the answer is no, right? Some people may take a Little Caesars, for example, model and create a fast, easy pizza that may not taste the greatest, but hey, it's a $5 pizza. And then some may go the route of like Giordano's, and we've got this, really well-crafted deep dish pizza, and yeah, it's really a lot more expensive, but man, does it taste good, right? And so at the end of that, the market is going to decide, right, which pizza it likes more. If you were to say, well, no, everybody has to have an equal outcome in this, well, then what's going to encourage somebody to want to choose, right? There's the proper word there, to choose to want to go into the business in the first place, but then also choose to do the type of pizza that they want. If they're all going to experience the same outcome, why have the liberty and freedom to choose? And so we really have to think long and hard about what we want in that regard. Do we want to live in a society where the government is playing the role of picking and choosing, or do we want to have that freedom? Do we want to have that opportunity and that spirit? Now, that's a very difficult proposition for a lot of people, right? Because when you choose, you have consequences. And that's the other thing that I tell my students often too, is that, if I were to give you this 70-minute period to do whatever you want in this classroom, right? And they all kind of chuckle and laugh at that idea and proposition. But the reality is that I would have a number of students who would use that time productively. They would use it wisely. But then I also know that I would have a number of students who would choose to not use it productively. But I'm giving them that option to choose. And, right, more importantly, those decisions that they make are going to have consequences. If you use the 70 minutes to get your work done and study, you're going to get a better grade. If you use the 70 minutes to talk and play games or do whatever, well, then your grade's going to suffer from that. We have to allow that outcome to occur, because that's the only way that you learn the best method and path to go down, right? Not me, the teacher, standing in the class and say, doesn't matter what you do over this 70 minutes, you're guaranteed to get at least a C. Well, what's the motivation for somebody to want to work then, right? Obviously, you've already told the person, doesn't matter what you do, you're going to get a C. Well, why should I work? Well, the person that really wants to aspire to an A, they're going to look at it and go, why put the extra work into it when I'm guaranteed to get a C? So that's what I want to leave you guys with, is thinking about that a little bit. And I know that it's much more complicated than just boiling it down to that. But again, trying to get back to the beginning and think about this from the ground floor level is what I'm hoping to accomplish with this today. I'm really looking forward again to this, guys. I hope that it's going to create some great dialogue and discussion. I hope that it, in a way, is going to enlighten you in some ways on some of these topics. And again, I'm going to post a series of different things that I've mentioned today in the podcast, so you can go back and read through some of those things that happened in the convention at Philadelphia on the Constitution. and encourage you to take time to read through that. Again, hope to have another podcast ready for you here within about a week or two. Until then, have a great day. If you've enjoyed what you've heard today, feel free to check us out on Facebook and Twitter. We also have an email account that you can contact us at. It's Margeson, Margeson, and Spears @gmail.com. And you can email us there directly. And until next time, have a great day.